So today it's my pleasure to talk with Professor Ann Mckee. She's professor of neurology and pathology at Boston University. She's director of the neuropathology for VA Boston, Veterans Administration Hospital. She's director of the Boston CTE Center, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and brain bank, where she's got the largest collection of brains from a lot of NFL players and veterans who've experienced traumatic brain injuries, even mild repetitive ones. And she's discovered by looking at their brains at autopsy that there's abnormalities. And so anyway, Ann, why don't you go ahead and talk about your background. You grew up in Wisconsin. I grew up in Minnesota. I was a Vikings fan. You were probably a Packers fan.
Oh, I was definitely a Packers fan.
So I'm happy this year. You're sad.
I'm not that sad.
I've stopped as well as the viewers and listeners will see after they listen to this. But yeah, I still watch football, but it's kind of strange. We have this kind of natural, we grew up with it, and it's kind of in our maybe epigenetics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I definitely think it's in our epigenetics. And I grew up in Appleton, Wisconsin, which is actually the small town that the visiting team stays. And so growing up in the 50s with Vince Lombardi and Super Bowl I and II, and then, having the visiting team stay in my very modest town, football's your life, and I definitely was raised in a football family with brothers that played football, dad that played football. They had me playing football in the summers. The only reason I'm not a football player is because I'm a girl.
You went to, so undergraduate, you went to University of Wisconsin, and then you went on to medical school, right?
I went to University of Wisconsin at Madison,
yeah.
And parenthetically, I was in the same class, or I think the class below Mike Webster, who was the first case of CTE that was described in an NFL player.
Huh.
And then I went on to Case Western Reserve, where I stayed for 9 years, and then made my way out to Boston and Mass General. And after, I think, 9 years at Mass General, I went to Boston University, which is where I am now.
And you're a neuropathologist, so you spent a lot of time looking under the microscope at brain sections stained with various stains. And
exactly.
But you started with Alzheimer's disease. It's kind of one of your interests.
Oh, yeah. And actually, I didn't start out as a neuropathologist. I started out as internal medicine, taking care of very sick patients, and got very interested in neurology and the brain as I was going through my internal medicine residency. I started training with Morris Victor, who wrote, Principles of Neurology with Raymond D. Adams, who was a phenomenal storyteller and a wonderful teacher. So I got very interested in neurology, but as you may remember, Morris Victor was married to Betty Banker, who was a world-famous neuropathologist. And as part of our neurology training, we had to do a full year of neuropathology. And believe me, it was pretty difficult. She was a very stern taskmaster and was always criticizing our dissections and our ability to make a differential diagnosis. And so I found myself eager to get out of there. But as soon as I started seeing patients again, I was like, well, what's going on in their brain? I just need to see their brain. And so I asked Morris Victor and Betty Banker if they would recommend me for a neuropathology residency. So then I did another residency in neuropathology, and that's how I find myself here.
Yeah, and as you may know, I was at University of Kentucky for 11 years, and Bill Marksberry was who you know.
Right.
Knew he passed away. So I learned a lot. I'm not a neuropathologist, but I learned a little from Bill, who was really good at, evaluating brains post-mortem.
Right. Yeah, and I crossed paths with him as well. In fact, just about 3 weeks ago, I was there for the Marksbury Symposium
Oh,
honoring Bill Marksbury. So that was a really pleasant time, and I got to become very familiar with their Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. And you may not know, but about 2 months ago, I was made director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center at Boston University
oh,
too. So now I have both of those hats.
okay. Congratulations, I think.
Yeah,
You're
exactly.
gonna
That's about how I feel about it.
you're gonna spend less time being able to look at brains, probably.
Well, yeah, and that is my love. I really enjoy that. But I'm trying to figure out how to sort of navigate these waters and still do what I really like to do.
And in Kentucky now has a number of people looking at traumatic brain injury as well.
Right.
Um, so why don't you talk about, the first case you looked at, the first NFL player's brain you looked at, and what you
Sure.
saw?
Well, actually, the first case I saw was as part, I'm the neuropath leader for the Alzheimer's Center for many years. And it was part of that. I was getting a patient. He was very well known in the area because he was a professional boxer. Everybody knew his name, and I can say it. It was Paul Pender. He had twice fought Sugar Ray Robinson for the title, and he was deemed to have Alzheimer's disease. He started behaving abnormally in his mid-50s, losing his memory, and he was evaluated by expert clinicians, but they felt that he had retired from boxing at the age of 32, and here he was presenting 20 plus years later. They felt that there was no way the two could be related. So they considered him to be a case of Alzheimer's disease, and then of course there was some hubbub in the hospital because of this famous person, but I didn't know anything about him except that he was this famous boxer. And when I looked at his brain several months later, I was shocked. I'd never seen anything like it. He had no beta amyloid. So, Alzheimer's disease was off the table. He had the most extraordinary tau pathology I'd ever seen. And I've been interested in tau pathology since the beginning of my days as a neuropathologist, because it entangles neurons, and it has this incredible distribution along connecting pathways, and it's just always been so mystifying to me. And here was Paul Pender. He had the most amazing tau pathology, and it circled around blood vessels, and it was very patchy, and it was at the crevices of the brain. It involved areas like the mid-thalamus and mammillary bodies that Alzheimer's disease rarely touches. I shouldn't say never, but almost never. And I became immediately fascinated by what he had. It was a case of one, and you can't do that much with a case of one. So
it was different than Alzheimer's, but it was also different than a disorder called frontotemporal dementia.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
It was very distinct. I mean, I was actually super interested in PSP and CBD, those frontotemporal tau disorders. And I knew it wasn't any of those. And so, you always wonder, is this a familial disease? You've got one person. So I started trying to find more boxers, and it took me, I subsequently found one more. He was also in our Alzheimer's Center. And I actually noticed the same pathology under the microscope that I'd seen in Paul Pender. Again, he'd also been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So now I had two, and I was still struggling to find more cases. And very coincidentally, as luck would have it, I was introduced to a person named Chris Nowinski, who was a professional wrestler. He fought under the name of Chris Harvard, and he had had a number of severe concussions, had gone to see another doctor, a neurosurgeon in our area called Bob Kant, who he was curious about his concussions. No one seemed to know what to do about that. He felt he was having lingering effects. And anyway, it's a whole nother story, but Chris Nowinski wanted to know if I'd be willing to look at the brains of football players, because he was also a Harvard football player. And I said, yes, I was really, it couldn't wait. So that was when I first got my first football player. His name was John Grimsley, 45 years old. And he had the most extraordinary tau pathology, no beta amyloid. It looked just like the boxer. And it was stunning to me, really stunning, because he was so young, 45. I was used to people getting neurodegenerative disease in their 80s. And, at the end of life, this was extraordinary to me. And because I was a huge football fan, and I had my brother's a family doctor in Appleton. He's subsequently retired, but, we would, how you doctor talk, and we were like, these football players are coming down with all these diseases, like we were watching the San Francisco 49ers with that cluster of ALS. And my brother Chuck had a few patients in his clinic that were former athletes who were getting these unusual complaints. And so when I saw this in this football player, first thing I did was run home to my brother and show it to him. And we were both flabbergasted, right? Because we were huge football fans. No idea that this is happening to them. No recognition that the knocks to the head are doing anything. They got those helmets, they seem invincible. There's no immediate injury or, immediate effects. And so that, both of us said, we got to tell the NFL, and that was our response. And we've subsequently I did present it to the NFL, but it was not the greeting that I was expecting. They were extremely critical and very, very, I would say, patronizing, and I'd even go as far as demeaning. But that was the beginning of the saga, and it's been a wild 15 years since then.
And now so how many brains of NFL players do you have in your bank there in Boston?
Yeah, I can't remember. We get brains 2 to 5 a week. And so I can't give you a running total, but I can say at last count, it was about 360 NFL players. We have over 700 individuals, a lot of them football players, but also ice hockey, soccer, lacrosse, rugby, military. So about 700 with CTE.
And is the average age of death for NFL players a lot less than the general population? Because
no, they have an increased risk for neurodegenerative disease, but overall mortality is not decreased.
So they're a lot of them are living with chronic neurological problems. Can you describe some of the they present to the clinic? What do you see?
Well, the most common symptoms are in the early stages are this personality and behavioral change. And it's often increased aggression. They can be physically or verbally violent. They can have a short fuse. So some little transgression, they sort of fly off the rails. They can be very impulsive. They can be very depressed. So that mood disorder of depression and suicidality definitely enters in. And in many cases, there's an awareness that they're just not, their brain isn't working right, that they're doing things, they're saying things, they're acting in ways that they feel like they can't control. And so that's different, obviously, than many neurodegenerative diseases that seem to come on without the person knowing.
And is there then, I just did a podcast with Amy Arnston at Yale on the prefrontal cortex. Is there a lot of pathology in the prefrontal cortex?
That's actually the most common area to be affected, and the most common area to be affected first.
So that can explain some of these symptoms.
Definitely.
They lose the decision making, controlling your emotions,
filter, right,
and cognition too.
And also cognition, and that's the other set of symptoms. So it's behavioral, mood, and cognition. They, start losing their keys, forget what they did earlier in the day. If you listen to the current NFL players that are concerned that they have this disorder, like, anyway, I won't name them right now, but often it's a cognitive issue, executive dysfunction, can't can't plan, can't organize, can't remember appointments, that kind of thing. Those are the early symptoms. And so they don't always, in fact, rarely come on while they're playing. They can come on while they're still playing, but it's more common to be aware of them some 2, 5, even 10, 20 years later. And the symptoms tend to progress, so they're not stable. Post-concussion syndrome tends to either stabilize or even improve, but these symptoms tend to get worse slowly. And
so most players, if you watch football games, occasionally you'll see someone who, has a concussion in the sense that they're like symptomatic, like right there, they're like, but in most games that doesn't happen. So they're getting these, not concussions, but kind of milder, but still.
We call them non-concussive hits. The hits can actually have, with accelerometers and the helmets, they can have the same G-force. They can be the same magnitude of hit, but for some, individual impact reason, they don't cause symptoms. And so there are these non-symptomatic, non-concussive hits, because a concussion really is just something that's a hit that's symptomatic. And we think that football players have hundreds to thousands of these every season. And over time, this cumulative injury dramatically increases their risk for CTE.
So the professional players, most of them, some of them know this now, right? When they go into the NFL, they must be aware of this. And
marginally,
but they, they make a personal decision, right?
Well, now they
do. But then if you look at younger ages, like kids and, high school and college, a kid, so I understand you've seen some brains of younger individuals who
quite a few brains of younger people, which I think is incredibly disturbing. And for a person that was comfortable or at least used to looking at older people's brains, I will never get used to seeing teenagers and young adults' brains who are coming in because of, catastrophes. And we have almost, at last count, it was 160 brains of people that haven't reached the age of 30.
So can you talk about, so I think you mentioned that there's, in the cerebral cortex, you have gyri, kind of the ridges, and then you have sulci, which are the kind of the grooves. And you're seeing this pathology like at the base of the,
preferentially in the grooves or the crevices. And part of that is the physics of the injury, that when you actually can do, 3D computational modeling, and then you do this acceleration, deceleration, rotational injury, you'll see the greatest physical deformation of the tissue occurs at these crevices.
Yeah. So if I take this piece of paper, right, and I bend it, so I'm applying the force here. Yeah. But it's actually, I don't know if this is right, but
no, it is. It's concentrated at the crevices.
Yeah.
And it's also concentrated at the interface of the blood vessels and the tissue, the brain parenchyma. And so characteristically, the initial, and in fact, the diagnostic lesion in this disease is this collection of tau in neurons around blood vessels at the depths of the sulci.
So do you think there's microbleeds then? There's like...
I do think there's microbleeds. I also think there might be some ischemia because it tends to be the watershed, the least, because even the areas where we develop it, part of it is the physics of their injury. They get a lot of hits to the top of the head and the dorsolateral frontal. Can be prefrontal. I mean, it's all prefrontal, but there's probably some ischemia there, but there's also vascular compromise, and we do see changes in the blood vessels with.
Now we did work with iron. Iron can be toxic, right?
Right. No, iron's super interesting to me. I'd like to do more work with iron.
Because the blood, there's a lot of iron if the red blood cells.
Exactly.
So Bill Marksberry, who I mentioned,
he was doing
this
that
method called llama.
Yeah, of course, I remember that.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to look at the.
It'd be extremely interesting to look at that. We actually did some single nuke seq, RNA seq in the white matter because I know we pay a lot of attention to the cortex, but I'm convinced there's a lot of change in the white matter even before CTE develops. And so we looked at the white matter with single nuke seq, and we found the oligos were reduced in number in CTE, but also the transcripts were increased in iron, in transcripts that have to do with iron and iron metabolism. So
and of course, these neurons that you see, the tau pathology, you're mainly looking at the cell body, but their axons,
right,
they go long distances
right,
through the white matter. And,
right.
so you could initially even have some damage to the axon.
Absolutely.
So let's back up a little bit more and talk about the cytoskeleton, I guess. So neurons have a cell body and then a long axon and a number of short branching dendrites. And in the axon, there are what are called microtubules.
Yep.
They're polymers, tubular polymers of a protein called tubulin. And then this tau protein that you're looking at, its function, one of its main function really is to kind of attach to the microtubules and stabilize them,
right,
so they don't fall apart,
right.
And then the cell body and dendrites, there's not so many microtubules. And
so we think that after a traumatic injury, the tau is translocated from the axon to the cell body and dendrite, and that destabilizes the axon. And we think there's early axonal injury. Proving that is a little less easy. We don't have a great method to look at axons, and we have neurofilament, and we have done some stuff with neurofilament showing that there's axonal injury, but I'd really like to be able to address it more quantitatively, especially in these young guys who probably have minimal change. It's a huge area of interest for me.
Early on, back in the early 90s, so a paper that caught my eye because I was doing a lot of work looking at calcium's kind of normal functions and regulating growth, and so you had a paper looking at a protein, calcium calmodulin kinase 2, CAM kinase 2, which is when neurons are active, calcium goes through channels in the membrane, calcium levels increase, calcium binds to a protein called calmodulin, and then that interacts with a number of things, but one is this kinase you looked at, CAM kinase 2, and that kinase then, its function is to add phosphate groups to various proteins and affect their function. But you saw some relation between that CAM kinase 2 and the neurofibrillary tangle. The neurons that seemed to be most vulnerable to the neurofibrillary tangle.
Right. Although I think that was Ken Kosic's antibody, and I'm not sure I have anymore. So I'm not, it was 30 years ago.
Do you know, so actually I wrote a book. So I retired 3 years ago from the NIH where I was a lab chief.
Okay.
And so I wrote one book on intermittent fasting because we'd done all this work on that.
Right.
Then I wrote a book, it's called Sculptor and Destroyer, Tales of Glutamate, the brain's most important neurotransmitter. And so these neurons, probably most of them that have the neurofibrillary tangles, they use glutamate as a neurotransmitter. And they also have glutamate receptors, and they can be prone to what's called excitotoxicity.
Right.
Do you see any evidence in CTA players that there's increased incidence of seizures?
Yeah, we get asked that a lot. It's unusual to have seizure, at least, we're not, most of our cases are coming in as brain donors, and we don't have beautiful neurologic phenotyping with, EEGs that were done even in the absence of a report of seizures. So we're relying on a previous diagnosis, and we're not seeing it. We mostly see it in the individuals that have a history of seizures. It's the later stages. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be doing EEGs on these people during life and maybe picking up something that's subclinical.
Now, you've interacted with the NFL Players Association, right?
A little.
A little. And, you know, obviously an obvious thing that is important in this regard is to have like prospective studies where you enroll these players, you know, maybe when they're playing or maybe right after they quit playing and then follow them.
We are doing those. We have a number of projects where we're looking at people prospectively. Right now, I think it's for 60 plus, but they have to have a history of, you know, exposure to head impacts. We have, you know, we're doing that at Boston University, both in the Alzheimer's Center and the CTE Center. And we're trying to get that down to young individuals. Like, we want to set up a prospective study of young individuals, because the white matter changes that we're talking about, the axonal injury, many groups have found that in living players with DTI after a single season, that they can develop white matter abnormalities. So I think these are incredibly important, maybe predisposing to CTE, maybe they're part of early CTE, but also I think they're producing symptoms. So a lot of our focus, or at least my focus, is getting towards these younger age groups where we're just seeing the beginnings of it.
And also you're at the VA hospital, so also military veterans who have have exposure, and they're probably, well, I don't know, I'm just guessing, might be easier to enroll in those studies even than the football.
Actually, they're harder.
Oh, really?
We've been really trying. We have a few hundred military veterans, but it's nothing like the buy-in. You know, we've had tremendous buy-in from the athletic communities, huge buy-in from football, families that see this in the media. And then, you know, when a loved one dies, they call our number. And there's been no attempt to recruit them, but they're just aware of the issues. And it has been very surprising to me. Yeah, you know, I've been running brain banks since I started this, but I've never had such a public buy-in of, we watched the work, we've been following it, and we want to see if this was something that was, occurring. And that's why we have so many brains coming in. I mean, it's actually almost hard to handle the number of brains that we're getting per week. We still don't have enough women. Women, interpersonal violence, women are in the military now. They are playing most of these sports. Huge interest in women, because concussion in women seems to occur more easily, and they have a longer recovery period. So is there something about the female brain, or is it just their neck musculature? But there's something different. There seem to be some gender effects with concussion, and we're wondering if that's true with CTE, but we don't have any information. There is going to be a lag because women weren't playing football and still don't mostly, but women weren't playing soccer, and they weren't playing all the hockey that they are now. So there is going to be a lag, and we're extremely interested in women. We also, just like everybody else, we need inclusion from diverse ethno-racial groups, African Americans, Hispanics, to understand those differences. But we do have a huge buy-in from football players. We're very grateful. And we get them at every level: high school players, college, pro. And we're seeing it in every level. A huge, we've had 2 papers now on dose effect, where we use number of years of football played, and it seems to be very significantly associated with risk for CTE. And then we just had a recent paper that did some fancy statistics that I can't even begin to talk about. And we found that selection bias, because everybody complains about our selection bias, right? This isn't your average population. These are people that have symptoms and they're presenting to the brain bank, and it's a very skewed population. But this last paper of ours showed that the selection bias actually minimizes the risk. If anything, it lessens the risk. And we're seeing that for every 3 years of football, that doubles your risk for CTE. So that's actually those are important and I think frightening numbers.
Yeah. So ultimately, lacking, hopefully, the ideal scenario would be that these sports would be changed so that to greatly reduce or, even, you mentioned hockey. So men's hockey, there's checking. Women's hockey, my understanding is there's not checking.
And also there's no checking, I think, below a certain age. So it could be changed. And enforcers in hockey, that's a whole nother thing. It's not actually part of the sport.
Yeah, that's the one sport where they just pretty much let them fight. It seems like.
That's right. That's right. And so hockey can be modified. It has some modifiable rules. Football, I think, is tough because it's intrinsic to the play of the game, unless they modify the game considerably. And also,
I did, in gym when I was in high school, I went to Mayo High School in Rochester, Minnesota.
That's funny.
Yeah, that's a lot of doctors' kids there.
Were you from a doctor family?
No, my dad was the prosecuting attorney for Olmsted County.
Oh, wow.
But there are a lot of doctors' kids at high school, and I was in all the AP science courses with them. But anyway, what the heck was I going to say? Oh, yeah. So, we played in gym class, we played flag football. We didn't play tackle football.
Right.
Although we did play hockey, but we didn't, there was no, I don't remember we were checking at all. But yeah, so, it's unfortunately, and particularly men, there's an evolutionary thing where somehow we like to see violence in a way.
Well, and I think the fans
I used to listen to and then watch when Ali was boxing, and I enjoyed that a lot. But now
I think you have a lot of company. I mean, people like violent sports. They enjoy that whatever that is. I mean, it's since the beginning of Roman civilization, they've liked deathly violent sports. And I don't know. So, and it's lucrative, right? These are big businesses. They make a lot of money.
Yeah.
So I don't think anything's going to change until it's in their financial interest to change the game.
Okay, then unfortunately that guarantees you of some more grant money for many decades to come, probably.
I don't know about that.
But so the key things are then, early diagnosis, are there biomarkers? You mentioned imaging to look at the white matter.
Yeah, we're getting closer with blood biomarkers, different forms of tau, that kind of thing. You can use imaging to rule out A beta, right? Because there's no beta amyloid in most of these guys. It tends to coexist later on in life.
So you see the hyperphosphorylated tau in CSF. Do you see it in blood?
Yes, you do see some in blood, but trying to make it a specific increase per individual player, we haven't gotten to that point. We have group effects.
We did, before I left NIA, there's a guy, you may come across him, Dimitros Kapagiannis.
Don't know.
He was a neurologist under me. He did a lot of work with extracellular vesicles, exosomes.
Exosomes, right.
And
we had some work with exosomes.
You've probably seen his published papers because he used an antibody against, it's relatively specific for neurons, a protein called L1. Anyway, let's just say it's a neuron-specific protein. So you have these vesicles floating around in blood. Some of them come from whatever, liver, some may come to muscle. We think some come from the brain. So anyway, he used an antibody specific for neurons and pulled out of the total pool of plasma exosomes those that are probably coming from neurons. And they're highly enriched in p-tau in patients with MCI,
Yeah.
AD, and then he took samples from the Baltimore longitudinal study of aging,
Right.
and had evidence that, and this is looking at Alzheimer's, but
Right.
prior to diagnosis, they have elevated p-tau. But the idea is it's kind of a better reflection of what's going on in the brain by isolating the vesicles.
Yeah. Well, we are doing some of that work.
Okay, good.
But we just haven't seen specific increases. That's the thing. You get generalized increases, but we need to get it to the individual level so we can use it as a diagnostic marker.
Yeah. Now, are there any treatments right now that can help with the behavioral problems?
Well, right now we can't diagnose it. So during life, we have gotten a lot farther with things. We know that on MRI, routine structural MRI, the things that make it more likely are frontal and temporal atrophy. It tends to be more severe in those regions, especially frontal. Cavum septum pellucidum is highly correlated with CTE, but not specific. It can occur, as a congenital issue, but I think you see a lot more fornicele atrophy. So the sides of the cavum are very, very atrophic and thin. And if I can get my radiological colleagues to agree with that, that might be a marker. So we do see some structural changes, thinning of the corpus callosum, especially posteriorly. We've seen on FLAIR MRI that there are white matter hyperintensities that seem to correlate with the p-tau quantitation and dementia. So that's something we could just, so we're getting closer. They're not entirely specific, but they can ratchet it up from, to possible, or it may be even probable.
Yeah. So combining the imaging with
right.
Looking at the p-tau in CSF or blood. And
I remain very optimistic that the more we look at these guys in life with out of the box neuropsychs, right? We can't just use the Alzheimer oriented neuropsych exams for these guys. They're different. They've got impulsivity and control issues. So I think once we start to look at them with neuropsychs that are really targeted towards these sort of disconnection symptoms that these patients have in the beginning, we might get better with that. I'm optimistic. I think we've gone as far as we can go with this retrospective interview that we've got, where we spend tons of time with the family. We get as much information as we can from multiple family members. We get medical records, but again, it's just not granular enough to really, specifically tease out what is CTE.
Now, into getting a cause and effect, I mean, it seems like it's pretty, it's very clear that, it's that repeated.
The only one who doesn't think, this is a generalization. The only people who believe there's no cause and effect are people whose livelihood depends on there being no cause and effect.
Yeah.
So, it's the sports leagues, it's the people that are paid by the sports leagues. There's tremendous pushback. But if you look, most of those individuals who think, science isn't proven, because they're expecting us to do a longitudinal study over 70 years with people who play and don't play football, and then wait till they die and then do the autopsy. Until we do that, there's no proof. If that's going to be your, whatever, your measure, then we're never going to get there. But among scientists like yourself, let's just say they found a similar disease now in musk oxen, which are gyrencephalic mammals that butt heads. They found.
Oh, wow, interesting.
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yes.
What about woodpeckers?
Woodpeckers, I don't know. They don't seem to develop it, but I have to say I haven't done any of these studies myself. I guess they've got some sort of tongue that wraps around their neck so that protect.
Yeah.
Don't ask me about woodpeckers.
So we're talking about animals, and a lot of research we do, and like what we call preclinical research. We use animal models to,
Right.
particularly when trying to identify treatments, because you can
Right.
you can go through a lot of treatments and a lot of animals, and kind of hopefully come up with something that can be translated to the clinic. Are there models of these like subconcussive?
People have tried to model it in mice and rats, and no one's really done. No one's coming up with a tau-based disorder. There's inflammation that occurs.
You know what? They don't. So we have the folding of the cortex, right?
Right.
The humans,
Right.
but the rodents don't.
Right. No, they
So
don't.
maybe that's.
Well, I personally think my rats and mice are never going to get CTE. They are, not only are they smooth brained or lisencephalic, they can do things like they can pancake their whole head to get on, in a crack under the door. It's just not. And their head, their head is horizontal. There are just so many differences.
You know what? The neurons, for some reason, in rats and mice seems to be more resistant to a lot of insults, because we have these models of Alzheimer's disease,
right?
Quote Alzheimer's disease, where there's tons of amyloid plaques. There are a lot of neurons with hyperphosphorylated tau, but the neurons are still alive.
Right. Exactly. And I think they're one of these, my feeling is the mice and rats are going to rule the world eventually, along with cockroaches, because they're going to be able.
Well, yeah, we're destroying the planet. We're destroying ourselves. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Let's see. Okay, Ann. Oh, inflammation.
Inflammation, very important.
Yeah, kind of the normal thing around these sites around the vessels where you get microglia.
Yeah, we get tremendous inflammation. Right. And but we also see before you get CTE, this significantly increased inflammation. You can see tremendous uptick of microglia just generally, and especially in the white matter. So there's an inflammatory response to just repetitive head trauma. And how much of that is causing symptoms.
Oh, now I just, so I mentioned to you, I can't remember if it was I guess it was before we started the podcast, Amy Arnston at Yale, and looking at prefrontal cortex, and she made me aware of something I wasn't before. There's a PET, positron emission tomography ligand for a presynaptic vesicle marker.
Yeah.
Essentially a marker for axons, terminals anyway.
I should look into that.
And I can't remember what she called it, but and that'd be really cool if you can do PET imaging with that radioactive marker for because then you could look at kind of a cutting edge level, I guess I'd say. And yeah.
Well, we are working with a bunch of groups on the PET, so I'll have to mention it to them, see if any of them would be interested in it.
Have you done radio-labeled 2-deoxyglucose or fluoroglucose to look at? Because
we haven't done it.
It'd be interesting to see if you have impaired ability of neurons to use glucose.
Yeah.
We did all this work. I mentioned intermittent fasting. So when you're fasting, your glucose levels are low, and then ketones go up, right?
Right.
And this guy up at Montreal, Steve Cunane, who I did a podcast with, he did PET imaging with the radio-labeled glucose, 2-deoxyglucose, and radio-labeled ketone. And he showed when he had people in a fasted state or with a ketogenic diet, the neurons switch to using
Interesting.
ketones. And we think that in Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment, which is often the kind of presages Alzheimer's disease, that there's impaired ability of neurons to use glucose, but we think they can still use ketones.
Interesting.
So that's a potential simple approach for these
Yeah,
people.
no, I mean,
Ketogenic
I've
diet
been following it. But it also seems to stave off these neurodegenerative diseases. Is that somehow true? That these intermittent fasting?
Well, maybe. We don't know.
Maybe.
In the animal models, it looks really good. In humans, it's just kind of, we know that people with, particularly if they have long-standing type 2 diabetes, which is kind of they're overweight or with obesity, and they're never ketogenic because
Right.
they're overeating, and they have increased risk
Right.
for age-related cognitive impairment. So
it's interesting.
yeah.
So can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead. These podcasts are kind of unique, I think, and they're kind of a back and forth. So in your case, I didn't have to spend as much time as other people who are, say, studying something I haven't been up on. So I take like a week and read up on what's going on. But yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
So I'm just curious. What do you do intermittent fasting? I know you used to.
Yeah,
and do you still do it?
Daily time restricted eating. So I don't eat breakfast, and I eat all my food within a 6-hour time window every day.
Or from like 12 to 6?
Yep. Yeah.
Interesting.
And
you've probably been doing that for years.
You've been doing that for years?
No, I said you've probably been doing that
for
years.
Yeah, I have. I've been doing it for more than 30 years. But I was even doing it before we did any research on it.
Oh, wow. How did that happen?
It was an accident. It was when I was a graduate student at University of Iowa, and we lived like 7 miles from campus, and I'd ride my bike in and back every day. And so I'd been eating breakfast, but then I ate breakfast and like I'd have whatever, oatmeal, orange juice, toast. And then I'd get up in the morning, eat, and then quickly get on my bike and ride in. And I started to have a lot of gastric reflux. Part of it was because of that, and then kind of the pressure of graduate school, I think. So anyway, I found just accidentally that if I didn't eat breakfast, my reflux would be much less, and then I just quit eating breakfast.
Interesting.
And then I was and then so I was at Center on Aging in Kentucky. Age is the major risk factor for AD, PD, stroke. Right. So we just asked the question, well, an intervention that's known to counteract aging and extend lifespan, caloric restriction or intermittent fasting, kind of ameliorate or lessen the severity of what's going on in our animal models. And we found it did. And then this kind of got popularized after we started collaborating with some clinical people. And there's it's a big deal now in the general public.
Right. And you were doing some work with somebody in Madison, University of Wisconsin, Madison, right? It just is vague recollection of mice work. Mice within intermittent fasting? That wasn't you. Okay.
No, that was start at Kentucky and then continued in my 20 years at NIA.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, whatever. So it's interesting. I mean, people are always asking, what can I do to make this, if I suspect I have CTE, what can I do? So I think that's a worthwhile suggestion.
And by the way, these football players, obviously they overeat, most of them.
Well, yeah. I mean, they have high body.
Have you looked at, is there any correlation between BMI and I don't know what the pathology, I guess, or the because in generally being overweight and having obesity, some of them would be considered to have obesity, I think, based on
Right.
how
Well, they're
big.
big guys.
It's
There's no
not,
question they're big guys.
it's not good for your brain in general.
Interesting. Yeah, no, a lot of them, that's a great suggestion. I'm going to look at that BMI thing. Again, it's retrospective, so we might not have good measures of BMI, but we certainly have people in the clinic now. And, first of all, their stature is quite large. They're larger than the average
Taller,
male. And we have to put them in a special MRI just to accommodate their
some
size.
of them are 300 pounds.
Right. And even I noticed that in their brain weight. I used to, looking at mostly Alzheimer's and degenerative disease, I was used to looking at brains on the lower, 1,200 grams, sort of 12. These guys can sometimes have 1,700. They have big brains compared to your average human being.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, you covered a lot of ground. I'm going to put in the description to the podcast. I'll put links to your lab in the Boston,
Yeah,
center.
and if you need any, we can give you links to the brain donation line and just things like that if anyone's interested.
Go ahead and just send them to me by email.
Okay.
And I'll put a link to the League of Denial, which I don't know what you think about that, but it seemed
I
okay.
liked it. I mean, I thought they got it right.
Yeah. Well, you probably made them get it right? You were kind of a central figure in it.
Yeah, in the second half, at least, is what I recall. But I remember I got so much flack because at some point I say, I'm beginning to wonder if all NFL players have this disease, because we were just seeing it in nearly everyone. And of course, that just blew up and people thought, well, she's obviously lost her mind. And then, then several years later, we came out with the 2017 paper that showed that 99% of NFL players in our brain bank had CTE. And I thought, well, okay, so it's only 99. I was wrong about that.
Yeah. Okay, well, this is a really important area, and I hope.
And I appreciate talking to you. I think you have a lot of good ideas, and I appreciate those.
Okay, I've been enjoying doing these podcasts so these are actually intended probably mainly for people, undergraduate state and up, who are interested in biology and particularly neuroscience, and lay public people. What I'm finding is a lot more people just listen to the audio on Spotify, for example, than actually watch the videos. And I learned from my daughter why this is so, because when I started these podcasts, I'd ask her if she's watched any of them, and she'd say, no, when are you going to get them on the audio thing, Spotify or whatever? And I said, why? And she said, well, I listen to them on my cell phone, and if I have YouTube running, the video has to be there, and that wears my battery down.
Yeah.
So it's just like, and then, a lot of people just listen to these while they're working in
driving,
the lab or working.
Yeah, no, I listen to a lot of things, but I don't, I have a short attention span for a video. I get kind of like, can I move it to the end? But for some reason, listening, I don't feel that same.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. Okay. Thanks a lot, Ann. I enjoyed talking to you, and I'll keep following what you're doing in this area. And I hope this makes a big impact. This is really important. These young or at least middle-aged
people. We want to protect the young athletes. That's what this all is about.
Yeah.
I don't want any more young athletes coming to visit me in my lab because they come in one way, and I don't like it. It's just terrible.
Yeah. And a lot of them get into football when, they're at an age that they can't really appreciate
Well, and
what,
depending on the community they grow up in, the adults may not embrace it at all. We're getting very, very different education to young athletes in the school systems, depending on where you live.
that makes sense. That I hesitate to say this, but probably in the more highly educated schools where the parents are more highly educated.
Right.
I mean, that's very likely what's happening.
That is part of it, but also in parts where football is really the identity of the community, there's just no attempt to embrace this.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of communities like that.
Yeah. And my wife's from Texas, and so I know about that.
Yeah, Texas, Florida.
They have high school football stadiums down there that you know, they have jumbotron things. It's some of them are as big as college football stadiums. It's
Yeah, and the other thing is, you know, they make a lot of money. These football events, certainly at college level, they're making money for the entire school. They're making money for the academic program. So there's huge repercussions to this. A lot of them are financial.
Yeah. So the administration at the colleges, you know, even though they may know about this CTE, for example, they're hesitant to. Yeah.
That's right.
But again, the game can, and we made the case with hockey, right?
Right.
You know, women's hockey, no checking. It's very exciting. It's in the Olympics now. You know, football could be.
Soccer could be done without heading.
Yeah.
You know, there are rules that can be implemented to make it safer.
Yeah.
We can reduce the amount of head contact in practice, you know, all sorts of things.
Yeah. Okay, Ann, I wish you happy holidays.
Yeah, you too.
All right. Bye.
See you later. Bye-bye.